hearts be ever acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. You may be seated. Well, this morning we had that famous verse, I do not say to you up to 70 times, but I say to you 70 times 7. When reading this passage, we often jump straight to the math of this number that makes up Jesus' response to Peter. Is this really a prescription for someone to forgive someone 490 times? Is this just hyperbole? Is this just Jesus delivering, this response to Peter for shock value? But what we often forget, I think, what we often overlook, is the man posing the question to Jesus in the first place. I will be the first to say, and you've heard me say it many times before, I think we often give Peter way too much of a hard time when we read the Gospels. Peter's impulsive, or Peter is always one step away from flying off the handle. Peter can't hold his faith long enough to not sink into the raging waters after getting out of the boat. But of course, I think the depiction of Peter in the Gospels is actually much closer to resembling you or I than many of the other characters presented. He means well, but the execution is often a little lacking. He believes in Jesus, but he's a little unsure of where his focus should be at any one time. He's definitely way off in his predictions of how Jesus' ministry is going to play out. You remember we read a few weeks ago, Jesus predicts his death, and Peter's the first one to say, excuse me, Jesus. That's not actually how things are going to play out. I'm never going to allow that to happen, so you can just rest at ease. And of course, Jesus rebukes him severely for that. Peter often seems like he's just doing his best to keep up, but he's still just a few steps, away from understanding where Jesus is actually headed. But as I've said before, I think Peter does a heck of a lot better keeping up than I ever would have. So after Jesus, which we read last week, gives this impassioned overview of how a sinful brother should be handled. Remember, go to him. Tell him how he's offended you. If that doesn't work, take somebody else. Take somebody else with you. And if that still doesn't work, bring him before the church. And if for whatever reason he still won't relent, he still won't ask for forgiveness, turn from his ways, then treat him like a tax collector and a heathen, Jesus says. So that's where we pick up here in the gospel passage. Peter, ever the pragmatic one, tries to get a little bit more detail out of Jesus. Okay, practical implications here, Jesus. If somebody wrongs me, if a brother wrongs me, and then he does it again, how many times do I have to keep forgiving him? How many times do I have to forgive my brother before I can just kind of write him off? How many times? Once upon a time in their marriage, my grandfather told me a story of something really stupid that he did. My grandmother just chewed him out severely for it. He apologized and they made up and went on, as they often did. However, from time to time, my grandmother would recount his misdeeds to him again. Does this ever happen with you? She would kind of bring it up. Hey, remember. And after doing that a few times, my grandfather sort of called her out. He said, honey, why do you keep bringing these things up? Isn't your motto forgive and forget? She says it is, but I don't want you to ever forget. I don't want you to ever forget that I've forgiven and forgotten. Jesus' cryptic numerology here is not so that we keep a running tally of how many times we've forgiven our brother, even when we feel like he's wronged us severely. The implication is that we shouldn't worry about some kind of forgiveness threshold. There's never a time that we should get to say, well, I just get to write you off now. You've wronged me 5 times now. I get to just pretend that you're dead to me. We don't get that. The problem is that we too often kind of treat people like that, even if we don't outright say it to them. We just, delete them off our Facebook friends, right? They're dead to us in the digital world now. Or maybe we see them, at Kroger and we just completely avoid them. Or maybe you go to a family dinner and you just know that you're not going to talk to that person. Ignore them completely. In our mind, we're still hanging on. Some of Jesus' strongest condemnations in his ministry are for 2 particular groups. You probably know this already. One is the self-righteous. This is the gripe that he has with the Pharisees most often. The second is those who refuse to forgive other people. Jesus is endlessly patient with, the tax collectors and the cheaters and the drunkards and the prostitutes. But the self-righteous and the unforgiving, he only ever has strong words of warning and even condemnation to. Why? Because pride is there. Pride exists in both cases. Pride is blinding. Ungratefulness is a despicable quality for someone who has been forgiven so much. That's the ultimate lesson, I think. So 70 times 7 is what Jesus says to Peter. 70 times 7 is how many times you need to forgive your brother that's wronged you. Why is that? Because forgiving someone one time is incredibly easy, right? Someone cuts you off in traffic. Oh, I forgive you. I'm so godly. I forgive you. Somebody causes you to, briefly lose your temper. I forgive you. But when there's a relational investment, when it's not a one-off occasion, when it's a little bit more difficult, when things get a little bit more complicated, is when we've been hurt in ways that cannot be repaid. Somebody can't make it right. There's nothing that they could say that makes us feel better. That's when forgiveness is a little bit more difficult. When the debt is not monetary or arbitrary, but something that causes deep, lasting hurt. It can be physically painful to even try and forgive someone who has hurt you to that extent. I read a quote the other day about patience. It was this. It said, "Lord, give me grace to handle this. Because if you give me the strength to handle it, I'm going to need some bail money as well." There are some debts whose full measure cannot ever be paid back. There's some debts so extensive, so complete, so hurtful that they cannot be repaid, even if somebody had 100 lifetimes to try. You know those hurts. You know those wounds. I think 70 times 7 may mean something a little bit different for most of us. 70 times 7 means, there's going to be a battle that wages constantly in your mind. You're not just going to be able to say, "I forgive you," and let it go. It's going to be a daily fight. You may have forgiven that person in your heart yesterday, but today you are harboring bitterness. You're harboring anger. 70 times 7 means every day, endlessly until the end of time, you're going to have to forgive that person anew. Moment by moment. It's always going to take excruciating effort to forgive that person, but that's what Jesus is talking about. Maybe if we think it in those terms, maybe 490 is not such an exorbitant amount. When Peter asked this question about how many times he must forgive his brother, Jesus responds, of course, with this, pretty astounding parable, right? A man is forgiven a debt A man who, is in debt up to his eyeballs, the equivalent of maybe even several $1 million. He's forgiven. His slate is wiped clean. But then he turns around and cannot forgive someone an arbitrary debt of a few $100s. Can't do it. And for whatever reason, he can't connect the two. He can't connect the fact that he's been forgiven of an exorbitant debt. He can't connect that with the fact that he needs to mirror that to his brother. There's no debt. There's no offense that could be done to us that could be the equivalent of what we've done to God. We've been forgiven to the extent that we could never even imagine. How can we not but forgive the debts of our brothers and sisters? How can we not do it? Jesus calls us to. Jesus commands us to. In fact, Jesus says, to the extent that you forgive is how much you're going to be forgiven. It's a sobering reality. But in that, it should give us joy in knowing how deeply the Father has forgiven us. I pray that as we grapple with this story, and we grapple with the ability, the struggle to forgive those who have wronged us deeply, I pray that God would give us grace anew every day to forgive 70 times 7, and however many times it takes for that forgiveness to last. Let's pray as we close. Oh Father, the slate that you've wiped clean on our behalf, the debt that you've forgiven us is more than we could ever even count. We're so grateful for the grace and the mercy that you've shown us. May we show that mercy to those who have wronged us, to our brother and sister, to our enemies, to our cousin or our sister, whoever it is, Father, that has wronged us and caused offense. Give us the grace to forgive them with all our heart. Be present to us in the breaking of the bread as we come to your table, O Lord. Amen.